The silence of the land was a language Chaitan understood. It spoke in the sigh of the wind through the sparse pines that clung to the hillsides, and in the distant, lonely call of a hawk circling under a vast, indifferent sky. It was the same silence that had settled into his and Winona's small, sturdy cabin, a quiet that was heavier than emptiness. For 10 years, that silence had been the ghost of the children they had prayed for, a constant, hollow ache in the heart of their home. In the year of 1887, their grief was a well-worn stone, smooth and familiar in their hands. They lived apart, nestled in a shallow valley carved by a creek that ran thin in the summer and froze solid in the winter. Their life was a rhythm of necessity, Chaitan hunting and trapping, his footfalls sure and quiet on the Dakota earth, and Winona tending her garden, her hands coaxing life from the stubborn soil, her knowledge of roots and herbs a legacy from her grandmother. They moved around each other with the deep, unspoken understanding of two people who had weathered the same long storm. Love was there, deep and abiding, but it was a thing shaded by sorrow, a garden that had known a permanent frost. That morning the air was crisp, carrying the first real bite of autumn. Chaitan was checking his line of snares along the creek bed, the rising sun casting long, cool shadows before him. He moved with a practiced economy, his senses tuned to the world around him. He noted the fresh scrape of a deer's hoof, the agitated chatter of a squirrel in the cottonwoods, the way the light fell on the water. It was this attention to the small things that had always kept him grounded, that gave him a purpose when the larger hopes of his heart had withered. He had collected a pair of rabbits when he heard it. It was a thin, reedy sound, almost lost beneath the murmur of the creek. At first he dismissed it as a kit fox or perhaps a distressed bird. He paused, head cocked, listening. The sound came again, a wavering, desperate cry that snagged on something deep inside him. It was not the sound of any animal he knew. It was too raw, too fragile. It sounded almost human. A cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He left the rabbits where they lay and followed the sound, his moccasins making no noise on the damp earth. The cries led him downstream, toward a thicket of willows where the bank eroded into a shallow cut. There, half hidden in the tall grass, was a coarse burlap sack. It was tied shut at the top with a length of rough twine, and it was moving, a small, frantic stirring from within. Chaitan's heart hammered against his ribs. He approached with caution, his hand resting on the handle of the knife at his belt. The smell that met him was sour, a scent of neglect and fear. The crying had subsided into a series of weak, hiccuping mewls. He knelt, his eyes scanning the surrounding area for any sign of who had left it here. There was nothing, only the indifferent trees, the flowing water, and this terrible living bundle. With deliberate movements, he pulled his knife and sliced through the twine. The mouth of the sack fell open. He peered inside, his breath catching in his throat, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The silence he had known his whole life was nothing compared to the one that now roared in his ears. Cradled in the foul darkness of the sack, tangled in a thin, soiled blanket, were babies, not one but 3. They were impossibly small, their skin pale and mottled with cold, their faces pinched and blue around the lips. They were white children, their tiny chests rose and fell in shallow, shuddering breaths. As the cool morning air hit them, one of them let out another weak, plaintive wail, a sound so full of helpless misery that it broke through Chaitan's shock and pierced him to the core. He stood frozen for a long moment, the world tilting on its axis. He looked up at the empty sky, then back at the impossible sight before him. This was not his world. This was a sorrow from the white man's town, a cruel secret discarded in the wilderness to be erased by the elements. His first instinct was a cold, hard pragmatism. This was a danger he could not afford. Taking these children would invite a world of trouble that he and Winona had deliberately built their lives to avoid. He should walk away. He should cover the sack and let the wilderness do what it was meant to do. But then he looked at their faces. He saw a tiny hand, no bigger than a leaf, clench and unclench. He saw the flutter of eyelashes against a sallow cheek. He thought of Winona. He thought of the 10 years of silent tears she had shed into her pillow at night, of the cradle he had carved for their first hope, which now gathered dust in the rafters of their cabin. This was a cruel trick of the spirits, a bitter irony. Or perhaps it was something else entirely. He could not leave them. Whatever the cost, whatever the danger, he could not be the man who walked away and left them to die. With a resolve that settled deep in his bones, Chaitan gently gathered the corners of the thin blanket, lifting the 3 tiny, fragile bodies from their grim container. They were so light, their collective weight less than a single sack of flour. He cradled them against his chest, their faint warmth a flickering ember against his own, and turned for home. He did not run, but his long strides were urgent, eating up the distance back to the cabin, back to the woman who was the center of his world, carrying a burden that he knew would change everything. Winona was scraping carrots from her garden when she saw him coming. She rose, wiping her soil-stained hands on her apron, a question in her eyes. She expected to see him carrying game, but he was empty-handed except for the strange, bulky bundle he held so carefully in his arms. His face was a mask of stone, but she knew him better than she knew her own reflection. She saw the turmoil in the set of his jaw, the deep conflict in his dark eyes. "Chaitan," she called out, her voice soft. "What is it? Are you hurt?" He did not answer until he was standing before her on the small, swept earth patch that served as their porch. He looked at her, his gaze holding hers, preparing her. Then, slowly, he folded back a corner of the blanket. Winona's breath left her body in a silent gasp. Her eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a dawning, horrified comprehension. She saw the 3 tiny, pale faces, the listless limbs, the utter vulnerability. Her hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment the world swam before her. All the years of yearning, of empty arms and a silent womb, rushed up to meet this impossible, heartbreaking reality. These were the ghosts of her own lost dreams, made flesh and blood and left to perish. "The spirits are cruel," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her first thought was a wave of the old, familiar pain, so sharp it was like a physical blow. Why show her this? Why bring her the one thing she could never have, only to present it in such a state of tragic abandonment? But as she looked, the pain began to transform. It melted away under a fierce, hot surge of something else. It was not pity, it was a primal, protective rage. She saw not the color of their skin, nor the circumstances of their arrival. She saw only life, flickering and fragile, on the verge of being extinguished. She reached out, her fingers, still cool from the garden soil, gently touching the cheek of the smallest baby. The skin was cold. "Bring them inside," she said, her voice no longer trembling but filled with a sudden, unshakable authority. The question of what to do, of whether to keep them, did not even exist in her mind. They were here, they were alive. Her purpose, which had felt so lost for so long, was now blindingly clear. Quickly, we must get them warm. The cabin, which had been a haven of quiet sorrow, instantly became a crucible of desperate activity. Winona directed Chaitan with a swift, certain energy he had not seen in her for years. They laid the babies on a soft buffalo robe near the hearth, where a low fire was already burning. Winona gently unwrapped them from the foul blanket, clucking her tongue at the sight of their thin, bony bodies, their skin chafed and raw in places. They were 2 boys and a girl. She worked with a tenderness that was heartbreaking to watch, washing them with warm water and soft cloths, her hands moving with an instinct she did not know she possessed. Chaitan built up the fire, his movements quick and efficient, his mind racing. Warmth was the first battle. The second was far more difficult. "They need milk," he said, stating the obvious, the words heavy with the near impossibility of their situation. "I know," Winona replied, her focus entirely on the infants. She had wrapped them in the softest linen she owned, cloths she had saved for a future that never came. She bundled them together for shared warmth, their tiny heads almost touching. "The Prescotts, their goat just kidded. They may have extra milk." Chaitan's face tightened. The Prescotts were white settlers, homesteaders who kept to themselves a few miles to the east. They were not unkind, but they were wary, like all the others. Going to them with 3 abandoned white babies was a risk. It was an invitation for questions they could not answer, for suspicions that could curdle into something dangerous. "Winona," he began, his voice low. "You know what they will say, what they will think." She looked up at him then, and the fire in her eyes was hotter than the flames in the hearth. "They are dying, Chayton. Do their thoughts matter more than this?" She gestured to the 3 small bundles, one of whom was now stirring, its mouth opening and closing in a desperate, searching motion. "I have been silent in my grief for 10 years. I will not be silent now while a child starves in my home. If you will not go, I will." He saw in her face not just a wife he loved, but a woman reborn. The quiet resignation was gone, replaced by the ferocity of a mother bear defending her cubs. He knew in that moment that he would ride into the white man's fort and face a legion of blue-coated soldiers if she asked it of him. Her fight was now his. "I will go," he said simply. He took his water skin and a small leather pouch for the milk. He paused at the door, looking back at her. She was kneeling by the fire, humming a low, ancient lullaby, a song she had never had a reason to sing before. The sight filled him with a potent mix of hope and dread. He was a man walking into a storm, with no idea if it would pass or if it would destroy everything he held dear. The ride to the Prescott homestead was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an accusation. Chayton rehearsed his words. He would be simple, direct. He would offer to trade, to work. He would not explain more than was necessary. When he arrived, Amos Prescott was out by his barn, mending a fence post. He was a wiry man with pale eyes and a beard that was more gray than brown. He looked up, his hand resting on the axe beside him, his expression guarded. "Chayton," he said, his voice flat. It was not a greeting so much as an acknowledgement. "Mr. Prescott," Chayton replied, dismounting slowly, keeping his hands visible. "I have come to ask for a favor, a trade." Prescott's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of trade?" "Milk, goat's milk. Your nanny just kidded, I have heard." The farmer's suspicion deepened. "Milk? What for? Your wife?" He trailed off, the unspoken question hanging in the air. He knew, as the whole sparse community knew, that Chayton and Winona were childless. Chayton met his gaze and held it. He would not lie, but he would not offer the whole truth either. "We have need of it. For the young, very young." He pulled a fine rabbit pelt from his saddlebag. "This for a pail of milk, and more tomorrow." Amos Prescott studied him for a long, silent minute. He looked at the pelt, then back at Chayton's stoic, unreadable face. He was a hard man, but not a cruel one. He saw the urgency behind the calm exterior, the faint tremor of desperation that Chayton could not quite conceal. Something was wrong, but it was not his business to pry, not when a fair trade was offered. "Martha," he called toward the house, "bring a clean pail, for our neighbor." He took the pelt from Chayton. "The milk is rich. You'll need to water it down for the newborn." Chayton's heart gave a lurch. "Yes, thank you." He had not known that. It was the first piece of grace in a day of turmoil, a small, practical kindness that felt monumental. He rode back with the precious pail of milk swinging gently from his saddle horn, a temporary victory that only highlighted the long, uncertain war ahead. The days that followed blurred into a cycle of exhaustion and relentless care. The cabin was transformed. The quiet was replaced by the thin, demanding cries of the infants. The slow, predictable rhythm of Chayton and Winona's life was shattered, replaced by a constant round of warming milk, feeding, cleaning, and trying to soothe the unsoothable. They learned to tell the cries apart. The girl, whom Winona named Otoka, meaning blossom, had a fretful, insistent wail. The larger boy, named Kangi, for the raven, had a lusty, demanding cry. The smallest boy was the quietest. He was frail, and his hold on life felt tenuous. Winona called him Tio for dwelling, praying that he would choose to dwell among them. Sleep became a luxury, snatched in brief intervals. Chaitan would take a shift, holding a crying baby against his broad chest, feeling the fragile flutter of its life, and he would feel a wave of fierce protectiveness that astonished him. He watched Winona, and it was like seeing the sun come out from behind a decade of clouds. The sorrow had been burned out of her eyes, replaced by a vigilant, tireless love. She grew thin from exhaustion, but her spirit seemed to expand, filling every corner of their small home. The cradle he had carved years ago was brought down from the rafters. It was too small for three, so they slept together in a padded crate by the fire, a tiny tangle of limbs. Their precarious peace, however, could not last. Word of Chaitan's daily trips for milk spread as gossip always does in isolated places. First, it was just curiosity. Then, suspicion began to take root. A week after they found the babies, the town sheriff, Henry Shaw, rode out to their valley. He was a large man who carried his authority like a heavy coat, and he did not dismount immediately, his eyes taking in the small homestead with a critical gaze. Chaitan met him outside, positioning himself between the visitor and the cabin door. Winona was inside, and he could hear the soft murmur of her voice as she fed one of the children. "Chaitan," the sheriff said, his voice devoid of warmth. "Been hearing some strange talk about you buying up goat's milk every day." "It is not forbidden to buy milk, Sheriff," Chaitan replied, his tone even. "It is when a man and his wife who have no children suddenly need enough milk for a litter of pups," Shaw retorted. "I'm here to see what you've got in there that has the whole county whispering." Chaitan stood his ground. "This is my home, and this is my jurisdiction," the sheriff said, swinging his heavy frame down from his horse. "I'm coming inside, either by your leave or without it." There was no choice. To resist would be to confirm every dark suspicion they might have. Chaitan stepped aside, his heart a cold stone in his chest. Sheriff Shaw pushed open the cabin door and stopped dead on the threshold. The scene before him was one of humble domesticity. The cabin was clean, the fire low and warm, and there, on the buffalo robe, was Winona, gently burping a tiny, pale-skinned baby. In the crate beside her, two other infants slept peacefully. The air smelled of wood smoke, herbs, and warm milk. The sheriff's face cycled through a series of emotions: shock, confusion, and finally, a deep, hardening suspicion. He looked from the white babies to the dark-skinned woman caring for them, and then to Chaitan, who stood silently by the door. "In God's name," he breathed. "Where did you get them?" "We found them," Chaitan said, "by the creek, abandoned." "Abandoned?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "And you didn't think to report it, to bring them to town?" "They were near death," Winona spoke, her voice clear and steady, though Chaitan knew her heart must be pounding. "The town is half a day's ride. They would not have survived it. They needed warmth and food immediately. We gave it to them." Sheriff Shaw walked further into the room, his boots loud on the wooden floorboards. He peered down at the babies, his expression grim. "These are white children. They don't belong here with you." Winona's head snapped up, her eyes flashing. "They belong with those who keep them alive. They belong with those who love them. We are those people." The sheriff was taken aback by her fire. He looked around the small cabin again, at the neat stacks of linen for the babies, the small pot of watered-down milk warming by the hearth. There was no sign of anything but care here. Still, the facts were unsettling. "There's a man in town," he said slowly, almost to himself. "Garrett Vance, powerful man, owns the big ranch south of here. One of his serving girls disappeared a little over a week ago. Rumor was she was in the family way." He looked at Chaitan. "He's been asking questions, putting the word out that he's looking for her." A cold dread washed over Chaitan. He had seen Vance in town. A man with a cruel mouth and eyes that missed nothing. If these children were his, he would not be looking for them out of fatherly concern. He would be looking to bury a secret. "We know nothing of this man, or his servant," Chaitan said. The sheriff grunted, his gaze lingering on the children. Maybe, maybe not. But if Vance gets wind of this, he's not a man who likes complications. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. You're on thin ice here. I'm not saying you stole them, not yet, but you should have brought them in. This whole situation, it's not right. When he was gone, a heavy silence fell in the cabin, a silence far more menacing than the one born of grief. They were no longer just saving 3 lives, they were now guarding them from a world that would not understand, and from a man who might wish them harm. He will come, Winona whispered, her arms tightening around the baby she held. I know, Chayton said, moving to bar the door. Let him. The threat of Garrett Vance hung over them like a gathering storm. Chayton began to take precautions. He slept little, his rifle always near at hand. During the day, he worked close to the cabin, his senses on high alert for the sound of approaching horses. He taught Winona how to load and fire the old shotgun they kept, her hands surprisingly steady, her eyes determined. They were no longer just a couple, they were a family, forged in crisis and bound by a shared, protective love. The children were growing stronger. Under Winona's relentless care, their skin lost its sallow tint and grew rosy with health. Their cries became more robust, their movements more energetic. Tio, the smallest boy, had a quiet, watchful nature. Kangi was boisterous and strong, and little Otoka had a smile that could cleave a man's heart in 2. They were becoming people, their individual spirits emerging like seedlings in the spring. For Chayton and Winona, the love they felt for them was a fierce, elemental force, a love that had been dammed up for a decade and was now flowing with unstoppable power. About 2 weeks after the sheriff's visit, the storm broke. It was near dusk, the sky bruised with purple and orange. A lone rider approached the cabin. It was Garrett Vance. He was a big man on a fine black horse, dressed in clothes that spoke of wealth and arrogance. He did not hail the cabin, but sat on his horse for a long moment, his cold eyes surveying the simple homestead with contempt. Chayton met him outside, his rifle held loosely but ready at his side. "You are not welcome here, Vance," he said, his voice low and steady. Vance sneered, a cruel twist of his lips. "I'm not here for your hospitality, I'm here for my property." His gaze flickered toward the cabin door. "The sheriff talks too much. I hear you found something that belongs to me." "We found 3 children left to die," Chayton corrected him. "They belong to no one but themselves." "They are the product of a foolish girl who worked for me," Vance said, his voice dripping with venom. "A mistake that should have been erased. I've come to correct that error. Give them to me." "No," Chayton said. The word was flat, absolute. Vance's face darkened with rage. "You think you can defy me, an ignorant savage living in a mud hut? I will have those brats, and I will burn this hovel to the ground with you and your squaw inside it." He spurred his horse forward, intending to ride Chayton down. But just as he moved, the cabin door opened. Winona stood there, the old shotgun in her hands, its twin barrels aimed squarely at Vance's chest. Her face was calm, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. "You will not touch our children," she said, her voice ringing with a power that stopped the big man in his tracks. Vance stared at her, momentarily stunned by her defiance. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think that old scattergun scares me? There's only 2 of you. I'll be back with my men, and we'll see how brave you are then." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his parting words a clear promise of violence. Chayton and Winona watched him go, the twilight deepening around them. They did not have to speak. They both knew the fight was not over. It had just begun. They spent the night in a state of high alert, taking turns watching the perimeter. The children slept, blissfully unaware of the danger that circled their small, fragile world. Chayton felt a cold resolve settle over him. He had spent his life avoiding the white man's violence, but now it had come to his door. He would not run from it. He would meet it. For Winona, and for the 3 small souls who had rekindled the light in their lives. Just after dawn, they heard the horses, not one but several, Chaitan took his position by the window, rifle ready. Winona was at the back, shotgun in hand, the children bundled safely in the root cellar beneath the floorboards. Vance returned with 4 other men, rough-looking ranch hands who carried rifles as if they were used to them. They fanned out, surrounding the small cabin. "Last chance," Vance yelled. "Send out the brats, and we might let you live." Chaitan's answer was the sharp crack of his rifle. He didn't aim to kill, but his bullet struck the pommel of Vance's saddle, making his horse rear violently. It was a statement: we will not be easy prey. The ranch hands opened fire, bullets thudding into the thick log walls of the cabin. Chaitan and Winona returned fire sparingly, making every shot count, forcing their attackers to stay at a distance. The siege was a stalemate. Vance and his men had the numbers, but the cabin offered good cover. Time, however, was not on their side. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, a new sound joined the sporadic gunfire, the thundering of more hooves, approaching fast. Chaitan's heart sank. He thought Vance had sent for reinforcements. But when the riders came into view, he saw it was Sheriff Shaw, along with Amos Prescott and 3 other homesteaders. The sheriff reined in his horse, his face a grim mask of fury as he took in the scene. "Vance," he bellowed, "what in the hell do you think you're doing? Cease fire now." Vance turned, his face contorted in a snarl. "This is none of your concern, Shaw. This is a private matter." "Attacking a man's home is my concern," the sheriff roared back. He turned to Amos Prescott. "You were right, Amos." He wasn't just asking questions. It was then that Chaitan understood. The farmer, after hearing the gossip and seeing Vance's men ride out, had become suspicious and had gone for the law. Another small act of decency, another unexpected grace. "They have my property," Vance insisted, gesturing wildly at the cabin. "They have children, Garrett," the sheriff said, his voice cold as iron. "The same children whose mother, we now know, was found dead in a ditch 2 miles from your ranch with a broken neck. It seems your private matter is now a murder investigation." The color drained from Vance's face. His hired men looked at each other, their loyalty vanishing in the face of a murder charge. They lowered their rifles. Vance, trapped and exposed, made a desperate move. He drew his pistol and fired wildly at the sheriff. Shaw was faster. His own gun bucked in his hand, and Garrett Vance crumpled from his saddle, a dark stain spreading across his chest. In the ringing silence that followed, the only sound was the faint, muffled crying of a baby from beneath the cabin floor. The aftermath was quiet. The sheriff and his impromptu posse took Vance's men into custody. He approached the cabin, his expression weary. Chaitan and Winona emerged, blinking in the bright sunlight. Shaw looked at them, then at the sturdy log walls pocked with bullet marks. "You should have come to me," he said, but there was no heat in his words. "Would you have believed us?" Chaitan asked quietly. The sheriff had the grace to look uncomfortable. He didn't answer directly. "The circuit judge will be through next month. We'll have to sort out the legalities of this, about the children." He looked over at Amos Prescott, who was watching Winona as she lifted the children one by one from the cellar, soothing their frightened cries. "Seems to me," the farmer said, his voice rough with emotion, "that the matter's already sorted. A parent is the one who raises the child, not the one who sires it and casts it aside. Those are their children." He nodded toward Chaitan and Winona, a gesture of simple, profound respect. Sheriff Shaw looked at the scene before him, the fierce, loving Lakota woman hushing the 3 small white babies and the quiet, resolute man standing guard over them all. He saw the truth in Prescott's words. Some things were more fundamental than laws written on paper. "Yes," he said, his voice softer than Chaitan had ever heard it. "I suppose they are." In the years that followed, the valley remained their sanctuary. The town's suspicion did not vanish overnight, but it slowly softened into a kind of grudging acceptance, then into a quiet respect. They were the Indian couple with the white children, a strange and remarkable family that had stood its ground. Chaitan and Winona raised the three children as their own, teaching them the language of the Lakota and the ways of the land, but also preparing them for the white world they had come from. Their home was no longer silent. It was filled with the chaos of scraped knees, the echoes of laughter, and the constant, vibrant pulse of life. One evening, years later, when the children were old enough to run freely through the valley, Chaitan stood with Winona, watching the sun set behind the hills. Kangi and Tio were skipping stones across the creek, and Otoka was weaving wildflowers into her mother's hair. The 10 years of silence felt like a lifetime ago, a distant memory of a different world. Winona leaned her head on his shoulder, her hand finding his. "The spirits were not cruel that day," she said softly. Chaitan looked at the three bright, beloved faces of his children, his heart full to bursting. He thought of the burlap sack, of the cold dread, of the impossible choice. He knew then that family was not a thing of blood or of skin. It was a sacred trust, a bond forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by a love that was fierce enough to face down the world. "No," he agreed, his voice thick with an emotion for which he had no words. "They were not cruel. They were giving us back our lives."